This video was brought to you by Imprint. China and Vietnam have always had a testy relationship. Despite being on the same side in the Vietnam War, after unification in 1975, the two countries almost immediately fell out over territorial disputes and Vietnam's close relationship with the Soviet Union. And they actually even fought a brief but bloody border war in 1979. Now, while things did get a bit better in the 90s, in the last few years relations have once again started deteriorating. This time over the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and Vietnam's budding relationship with America. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the modern history of Sino-Vietnamese relations, why things have got worse recently, and what this says about China's diplomatic priorities. So let's start with a quick history of Sino-Vietnamese relations. Broadly, relations can be split into three periods. From the unification of Vietnam in 1975 until 1990, when China and Vietnam didn't really get on. From 1990 until about 2013, when relations began to improve. And the last decade or so, when relations have once again started deteriorating. But before we get into those more recent developments, let's start with the first period, beginning after the fall of Saigon in 1975. Now, you might have assumed that China and Vietnam would be best mates here, given that at the beginning of the Vietnam War in the 50s and 60s, China was basically Vietnam's only real ally. China was also the first country to formally recognize North Vietnam, and China provided generous military and economic support to the Vietnamese Workers' Party throughout the entirety of the war. The same certainly can't be said for the Soviet Union, which only started providing military support towards the end of the war, and actually suggested that both Vietnams should be simultaneously admitted to the UN in 1957, essentially calling for North Vietnam to accept the status quo. So, unsurprisingly, when China and the Soviet Union fell out in the early 60s, Vietnam originally took China's side, and they became so close that in 1967, Mao described the two countries as being as close as between lips and teeth. However, relations did become strained towards the end of the war. This is in part because China didn't agree with the way that the North Vietnamese leadership were prosecuting the war. But the main issue really was over the Soviet Union. In the late 60s and 70s, North Vietnam had started buddying up with the Soviets, in part because they started to more actively support Vietnam with technology that China just couldn't provide, including surface-to-air missiles. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this didn't go down all that well with China, with the Chinese premier actually telling Vietnam to refuse Soviet aid. But Vietnam didn't listen. At the same time, and even though China was actually escalating its military support throughout the 70s, North Vietnam resented China's diplomatic overtures to the US, who began increasing their support for South Vietnam in the late 60s. For context, China and the US didn't really get along all that well during the 1960s, but in the early 70s they began repairing relations, and in 1972 Nixon went to China to meet Mao, with full diplomatic relations established 7 years later in 1979. It wasn't just this that was causing tension between China and Vietnam, though. There were also significant border disputes over the Sino-Vietnamese border, as well as the status of various islands in the South China Sea. And all of these issues resurfaced after unification and became more acute following the discovery of oil in 1969. Then, in 1975, Vietnam renounced a colonial-era agreement with China, and in 1979, Hanoi claimed sovereignty over literally all of the South China Sea islands. Tensions eventually boiled over in 1979 after Vietnam invaded Cambodia, a Chinese ally, sparking a brief but bloody border war with China in Vietnam's northern provinces. Relations didn't then recover until 1990, and there was even another brief conflict over some of the islands in the South China Sea in 1988. As I said though, relations did broadly recover in the 1990s. In some sense then, the discord in the 70s and 80s was caused by the fact that China had been used to Vietnam being its smaller, weaker neighbor. But in the 70s, the balance of power had tipped in Vietnam's favor. China was no longer much wealthier than Vietnam, especially after Mao's disastrous Cultural Revolution in the late 60s, and Vietnam's alliance with the Soviet Union gave it new geopolitical confidence too. By the 90s, though, the normal balance of power had more or less restored. China had conclusively demonstrated its military superiority, and China also began to outstrip Vietnam's lagging economy after Deng Xiaoping's reforms in 1979. As such, Hanoi and Beijing normalized ties in 1991, and in 2000 they formally resolved their border dispute. And after this, China quickly became Vietnam's largest trading partner, and today still accounts for about 25% of all Vietnamese trade. However, in the past few years, relations have once again started deteriorating, for two major reasons. China's increasingly bellicose behavior in the South China Sea, and Vietnam's blossoming relationship with the US. And interestingly, this is an almost perfect reflection of the 70s, when the two countries fell out over Vietnam's expansive territorial claims in the South China Sea and China's budding friendship with America. So let's run through how things are playing out this time round, starting with the South China Sea. For context, China claims historic rights to about 80 to 90% of the South China Sea via what's known as the Nine-Dash Line, which, as you might have guessed, involves a set of 9 dashes. Now, this obviously doesn't go down too well with the other countries in the region, who all occupy at least one island in the sea. But despite this, since 2013, China has become more assertive in the region, building new man-made islands and sending ships to harass other countries. This has gone down especially poorly with Vietnam, and in 2014, massive anti-China protests broke out after China sank a Vietnamese fishing boat and deployed an oil rig in a disputed part of sea. Tensions have only escalated since then, though, as China has become increasingly assertive. And polling by Pew Research suggests that most Vietnamese now see China as a threat and not an ally. In response, Vietnam has begun to buddy up with the US, who regularly send its navy into the South China Sea in order to conduct freedom of navigation exercises. And just last week, Vietnam and the US signed a comprehensive strategic partnership. In response, China duly accused the US and Vietnam of possessing a so-called Cold War mentality, which Vietnam has denied. Vietnam's other motivation for budding up to the US, though, is trade, because the country is very keen to replace China as the world's manufacturing hub. And during Biden's visit, executives from top American companies, including Google and Intel, met with their Vietnamese counterparts to discuss investing more in Vietnam. You get the idea then. Vietnam is falling out with China, and America is elbowing in, straining tensions yet further. Ultimately then, Vietnam will be a pretty interesting test case to figure out quite how much diplomatic capital China is willing to lose in order to assert its controversial territorial claims. China's aggressive territorial claims and its wolf warrior diplomacy have already isolated it diplomatically, allowing the US to form a web of counterbalancing alliances in the region. So far, this hasn't deterred China, but it's obviously a risky strategy. And the fact that Vietnam, a socialist country that literally fought a war with America, is now closer to the US than China, doesn't bode well for China's ambitions for reconfiguring the world order. So perhaps instead of trying to change things, China might decide that they ought to make more alliances and create new friends. Unfortunately for them, they don't have all that long to do so. So they might want to check out a book like Dave Carnegie's How to Make Friends and Influence People on Imprint. Just like TLDR, Imprint is all about helping you learn quickly, conveniently, and visually. It's super quick because most of their lessons take less than 2 minutes to complete, summarizing knowledge from all kinds of topics and using Harvard professors and best-selling authors to teach you key concepts. It's convenient because it's all housed in their easy-to-use mobile app, letting you replace doom scrolling with actual learning. And it's visual because, well, look at it. Their animated explanations help you stay focused, understand concepts quickly, and actually retain what you learn. So join the millions of users learning with Imprint, including me. I'm taking their multi-day flow course right now. And do that by using the link in the description. Plus, if you use that link, you'll get a 7-day free trial and get 20% off an annual plan when you sign up. And they'll know that you came from us. So check out Imprint, support our new sponsor, and thanks for watching TLDR.